Hi everyone, welcome to our weeks 8 to 10 revision on some of the exciting new work that we discussed in our next class. Okay, so we're going to start off with ecosystem services. So I am sure you know what ecosystem services are. We have touched on it during our time in class as well. But when we look at defining ecosystem services, we can define it as the benefits that people obtain from ecosystems. So, what are the benefits, for instance, if we go to a national park, for instance? The benefits could be apart from the cultural values like research opportunities or relaxation. A national park can also provide ecosystem services in terms of biodiversity, for instance. There can be a lot of wetlands that can also provide an ecosystem service in terms of clean water and so on. So when we talk about ecosystem services, we have four main categories. And these categories you also have to include in your assignment. We have provisioning services, we have regulating services, we have supporting services and cultural services. So when I talk about provisioning services, it's what nature provides, for instance, in the form of food and water. Regulating services in terms of regulation of floods, how nature also work in terms of curbing drought conditions and also disease. Then in terms of supporting services, how nature supports the communities and the living communities around it. That's in terms of forming soil, cycling nutrients. For instance, we have various nutrient cycles as well. And then also we have cultural services. And cultural services can be in the form of recreation, like relaxation, scientific, the ability to conduct research in an area, spiritual, and other non-material benefits. So we can expect many ecosystem services to go almost unnoticed by the vast majority of people, especially when there are public non-excludable services that never enter the private excludable market. So for instance, think of the ability of wetlands to regulate storms. You know, when we start digging deeper into what nature provides for us in terms of uh, regulatory services, supporting cultural and provisioning services, we start really coming closer to answers in nature in terms of how valuable intact natural areas are, and especially when we talk about rehabilitating areas. We also need to think of rehabilitating ecosystem services because that is very important. You can't have a natural area or reconstruct or try to reconstruct a natural area if you don't also enable and put the switch on ecosystem services. So the benefits that one receives from functioning ecosystems do not necessarily depend on one's ability to pay for them in monetary units. And there's been plenty of discussions in terms of putting a monetary value on ecosystem services. And you'll find that a lot to do in ecological and environmental economics. So ecosystem processes of function can also be services, and the same services can be both intermediate and final. So this is just an example of the CICES. We have version 5.1 now. And that is basically an organization that publishes various ecosystem services, a list of ecosystem services as well. I wouldn't say it's a complete list because I think obviously you might also be able to think of other ecosystem services which might not be on the list. However, it is a globally accepted list from CICES, and you can also, I've also posted this specific list on your Learn platform. So then you can go and have a look at the type of ecosystem service and what it entails, especially when you complete your assignment on your case study. So when we look at classifying ecosystem services, it can become problematic when we try to measure ecosystem services or when we need to design a system to classify ecosystem services so that we can report on the results clearly. So the naming of ecosystem services is also often different between initiatives and service categories, and you'll see that as well. The naming of one ecosystem service can also be different under another list that gets published as well. For instance, other organizations that also report on ecosystem services. So because of all of that, there was an attempt to provide a framework that could at least be used to translate between the systems specifically for the public. And work was undertaken as part of the development of the revision of the System of Environmental and Economic Accounting, SEEA, which was led at that time by the United Nations Statistical Division. And that resulted in CITES, Common International Classification of Ecosystem Services. And they do revise the list from time to time. And the aim of that list is really to assist people to identify what is an ecosystem services and to navigate between the different typologies that have evolved around the ecosystem service concept. So it's a list that really helps the public to understand what is an ecosystem services, and when they do need to do a specific project or conduct a specific project, then there is a standard list that can be used, that is accepted globally, and that you can use in projects as well. So while developed initially in an accounting context, it has been taken up more widely by the ecosystem service community around the world. For instance, this framework is also used in the EU MAES process, and that aims to map ecosystem services at the European scale in order to meet the commitments made under Action 5 of the EU's, the European Union's Biodiversity Strategy 2020. So there's also other work that was done, and that suggests that a classification might be seen as part of a more general systematic approach or a blueprint for mapping and modeling ecosystem services. And then in looking to develop these more standardized approaches, another author have also argued that it is especially important to develop classification systems such as CITES that are geographically and hierarchically consistent, so that we can make comparisons between regions and integrate detailed local studies into broader geographical understanding. And that's just again coming back to the argument as to why do we need a standardized global list. It's that when someone uses that list, at least it's from a global standard and you can work from that going forward. Okay, so the CITES framework, the evolving nature of science of ecosystem services and the way it is practiced together with a field that brings together a range of disciplines, each with their own terminology, means that the design of a classification system that meets all the needs is a major challenge. And you'll see when our discussions continue just now, there's been specific discussions around including the abiotic part of ecosystem services as part of this list. And after a lot of consultations, the organization that is responsible to compile the list, CITES, then decided, they are going to include abiotic services as well, under ecosystem services as well, which I think is much welcome because that was quite a big gap in the framework. So the development of CITES illustrates many of the issues involved, and the fact that we must probably think of the creation of a classification system as a process rather than a design problem can be solved in a single step. So CITES was created through a consultative process, initially as part of the efforts to design, integrate environmental and economic accounting systems, but latterly by involvement of the wider ecosystem service community. So a key consideration to 2009, when this process actually began, was that wherever possible, the system should have resonance with other widely used classifications, especially in relation to terminology. That's very important because it's very confusing to work on a specific project and you have different definitions for different concepts. So this also then helps to formalize this on a global level, that you can work from something that has already been defined and the definitions are there. So CITES took as its starting point the typology of ecosystem services suggested in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. I think you've heard of that before, and refined it to reflect some of the key issues identified in the wider research literature. So in 2013, version 4.3 was published, and 2018 5.1, and we're still on version 5.1, and this is available on your platform. So it's built on the principle that a classification of services need to describe the contribution that ecosystem make to human well-being, defined in terms of what ecosystem do and what do they do for us. So in the classification of the definition of a service, it needs to highlight the ecological outcomes that particular ecosystem characteristics or processes generate that can ultimately benefit people and also the other parts of the working parts of nature. So the aim has therefore been to build a classification system that identifies the purposes or uses that people have for the different kinds of ecosystem service and associate them with the particular ecosystem attributes or behaviors that support them. Okay, so here version 5.1, you can see we've got, you can read through that document as well. We've got provisioning, we've got regulation and maintenance, and cultural as well. So there's quite a lot of work that has been done to try and identify most of these ecosystem services, biotic, living, and abiotic, non-living, under provisioning, regulation, and maintenance and cultural. And you see in your own work going forward, there is going to be a lot of focus on ecosystem services. So here's also an example of what that list looks like. You've got a section, the main category is provisioning, then they can put that into different divisions and groups and classes. And then they also have other kinds of categories that they also associate it with in terms of the Millennium Assessment as well. So have a look at that list and that document that I have provided. Okay, so when we just go through the way in which CICES have drawn up this list, we can look at basically considering the highest or the most general level of the three familiar categories used in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment: provisioning, regulating, maintenance, and cultural. So below these major sections are a series of divisions, groups, and classes. And this is then just looking at really breaking it down in an orderly way, these ecosystem services in terms of the main categories. Okay, so when we look at the ecosystem service in the photos, what would you say are the type of ecosystem services that we get here? Remember, we get provisioning, we've got regulating, we've got maintaining, and we've got cultural. So when we look at cultural, this can be an area where we can conduct research. It can be an area of spiritual value, that's also an ecosystem service, and it can be a place of relaxation as well. So when we look at regulating, how does nature basically, what do they regulate that could be of benefit to us? This is in a forest ecosystem, so there can be regulation in terms of soil formation, for instance. When we look at provisioning or what they provide, clean water, there's processes that's happening in this ecosystem that can clean water. Oxygen, there's a lot of ecosystem services that you think of, right? If you just look at this picture, there could be food that can be provided. Biodiversity can be, in a sense, maintained and provided as well. So there's a number of ecosystem services that you can think of here. The same here. This is a farming community as well in Southwestern Cape. Here we can have food that can be provided. There can be basically maintenance of biodiversity services. There can also be, this is also unique ecosystems, and when you look at specific ecosystems, you also need to think of what makes that ecosystem basically unique. So here specifically, there's a lot of focus on biodiversity, especially with your succulent plants. So here's maintenance of definitely of biodiversity, of cycles in terms of maintaining biodiversity and also providing biodiversity to the area. Also the kind of plants and animals, invertebrates, insects, everything is connected here. So there's quite a number of ecosystem services applicable here. When we look at this specific area, which is also a wetland, we can also look at the provision of clean water, maintaining nutrient cycles, for instance. There's habitat provided for a lot of species here. and also biodiversity maintenance. It can be aesthetic, spiritual, research opportunities. There's a lot of ecosystem services applicable. The same year, you can just think of maybe a couple of ecosystem services here. This was taken in the Bloemfontein National Botanical Area. So you can just imagine all of the ecosystem services that is applicable here as well. This is an area in the Lowveld, taken in the Kruger National Park, and there's a whole host of ecosystem services that you can go through here. So take your list, your CITES version 5.1, go through it and then see, what do you think, what ecosystem services are applicable here? And I want you to do this exercise for the next few pictures as well. You can stop the slideshow and the presentation and then see if you can identify the ecosystem services. And this is also a very important example because this is taken in Pretoria, in a specific housing estate. And there's a number of ecosystem services here, and of importance are the integration, a full integration of your human component here, with the social component, with your natural component, and they interact on one another. That's going to also be a discussion on the next part. Sugarcane agriculture, close to Malalan. There's also a lot of ecosystem services here that nature provides that enables agriculture as well. And that is also why there's quite a big focus on aspects such as eco-agriculture. And we see that quite aggressive approach from ZZ2, the farming company in Limpopo, and also other areas in South Africa where they farm, that focus a lot on eco-agriculture, where they really zoom in on capitalizing on what nature can provide to work and to align that with agricultural practices in terms of a more sustainable approach. And that is then where you really start going into the right direction. It might not be possible always to go that approach in terms of eco-agriculture, for instance, area that you might be located or the type of crops that you provide. But there's a lot of research ongoing in that specific field to advance it even further. It's a very exciting field that really focuses on contributing and also using ecosystem services to the benefit of agricultural practices. And this is just also a town concept. This is a photo taken of Barberton. And there's also a whole host of ecosystem services taking place in this area, in a town setting as well. See if you can identify some of the ecosystem services. This is a tourism establishment in the highlands of Lesotho. Of course, there's also a whole host of ecosystem services taking place here. And this is another photograph, and you can also have it gives a bit of a more eagle-eye view of the area, and you can also see, especially with the development in the valley, there's mining, there's agriculture here as well, and the ecosystem services that's provided that enables those kind of industries as well, and they do support them in a way as well. And our work would be to see how we can fix or restore broken connections between the socio and the natural sides in terms of socio-ecological connections, and also then how we can utilize and capitalize more on ecosystem services in terms of integrating that into development towards sustainability. This is just a picture of the Olifants River, which is in Kruger National Park on the Letaba area, and there's a whole host of ecosystem services, of course, playing out here. And this is just a project I had earlier, utilizing the microbes in the soil, specific microbes, to actually rehabilitate contaminated hydrocarbon-based soil. And that is now looking at utilizing the provisioning and the maintenance and the support side of ecosystem services that actually turned this contaminated soil around, that you can use that as compost. So that was quite an exciting project, and that's how you can utilize ecosystem services and bring them into your projects. That could be quite a benefit in terms of integrated catchment management and water quality management. Then the question is also, how can we integrate ecosystem services in rehabilitation of aquatic ecosystems? And here's the example of floating islands. Of course, we still have a far way to go to actually understand exactly all of the functioning of nature, but it's a start definitely, and we see this in terms used such as nature-based solutions or ecological engineering, where we start developing sustainable ecosystems with a bigger focus on ecosystem services and not just having a completely green kind of approach and viewpoint, but really having an approach that makes sense, and that is looking at coupled human and natural systems, and that's going to be a discussion on our next part. Okay, so here is also a specific example closer to home on the Cape Winelands district on identifying ecosystem services. So here you can see the source of ecosystem services in the first column, and I've not placed that in one of the 4 categories, although you can relate that to one or even more of those 4 categories. But here they specifically looked at biodiversity, water, air, land, and soil. And you can see there's examples of these benefits, what that translates from ecosystem services. So you can go through that list. So, like I mentioned earlier, there was quite a lot of discussions around what should CITES cover and what should it exclude. And the main argument was surrounding abiotic ecosystem outputs. So a key difference that emerged during the consultation was the extent to which the notion of ecosystem services included abiotic or non-living outputs such as hydro or wind power, minerals such as salt, etc. And we see that coming a lot into especially the renewable energy part of sustainability. So on the one hand, people argued that although such things were produced by natural processes, they were not dependent on living processes. And that meant that the classification would water down the importance that biodiversity had in future assessments. And my personal opinion would be that the abiotic component enables living processes. You can't really separate it from living processes. So I feel very strongly that your abiotic components need to be included. So the position was further reinforced by the argument that if abiotic outputs from nature were included, where would we stop? Should fossil fuels, for example, also be included? I would say, why not? But the danger here, and that's what people felt, was that if these were included, their values as ecosystem services would outweigh many of the others. So the counter argument was that many people, especially the public, would who might be consulted during an eco-assessment would not see the distinction between biotic and abiotic outputs. That's fine, and I agree with that. Although this can also be always translated general public, but these ecosystem services are used a lot in specialized environments, whether it's in the public or the private sector. So that counter argument, although it holds some water, is not too strong for me. But by excluding renewable energy sources such as wind and wave power, would we not tend to exclude a whole category of things that nature can do for us? And I agree. So in your assignment, if you feel strongly about an ecosystem services that is not on that list, please include it. Okay, so the argument then continued on CITES on whether abiotic ecosystem service output should be included. And it was not made easier by the fact that in all the systems currently used, water is generally included as a provisioning service. And remember, water is not a living component, it's an abiotic component. So, although living processes certainly affect both the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and the economics of environmental and biodiversity, or DEEP, water is regarded as provisioning service, notwithstanding the fact that the material output is largely generated by abiotic hydrophysical processes. So, when CITES version 4.3 was released, a rudimentary table of abiotic ecosystem outputs was provided using the same classification logic as for those ecosystem services that depend on living systems and water. And this approach was then actually followed in a largely upgraded version 5.1. However, this has been extended and a spreadsheet filter tool is available to allow users to integrate biotic and abiotic categories into the same table if they need it. And then over half of the people who responded to the 2016 survey suggested that a classification of abiotic outputs would be useful. Fully agreed. Okay, so there is some problems in terms of abiotic ecosystem outputs, but they still remain quite a significant ecosystem service. So you can read through this in terms of what CICES felt was the problem with abiotic ecosystem outputs, but I am still very of strong opinion that your abiotic ecosystem outputs are so important because they enable the living part of ecosystem services. Then when we talk about natural capital, I think you would have heard about natural capital or ecological infrastructure. And we have ecosystem capital in the form of ecosystems as assets, and then also ecosystem service flows or ecosystem services. And then we have abiotic assets, abiotic flows, that is either non-depletable and depletable. And those are actually what was also used in terms of developing ecosystem services. So also think in terms of your own project, what are the natural capital that you have? And then what are your abiotic assets, your abiotic flows? What are your biotic assets, your biotic flows, for instance? And then you can also categorize your ecosystem services much better. Okay, so take a moment just to recap on ecosystem services. Make sure that you fully understand that. Go and have a look at the specific question in your summative assignment. And remember, the ecosystem services need to be unique from your case study site. It's not just something that you can copy and paste from the CICES version 5.1 sheet. It's important that you can identify and interpret what ecosystem services are applicable in your case study. Okay, so stop the presentation, go and have a look at the specific question, make sure that you've read the prescribed articles, and then come back to coupled human and natural systems. Okay, so when we look at CHUNS or coupled human and natural systems, we talk about the connections, the couplings or interrelationships between your natural and your human systems. They are also referred to as human natural systems, socio-ecological systems, human environment or human environmental systems. So in coupled human and natural systems, your interactions and feedbacks, almost like your reactions inside of your systems, they occur between the environment or the natural systems and the human systems. So a CHUNS has its own function and structure and characteristically includes three aspects, namely the natural systems, the social system, and the economic system. So when we look at the Anthropocene, it has become widely accepted as the increased magnitude and range of the human influence on our planet. You will hear a lot of videos, a lot of books, a lot of people talking about the age of the Anthropocene. And that's the age of humans, basically. And then at the same time, in the Anthropocene, it's important to take note of the supportive role of natural ecosystems for human society. And that it has moved gradually to being understood. And also the concept of ecosystem services has been widely applied. However, many integrated interdisciplinary studies of the coupling between human and natural systems have been conducted, in which concepts such as human natural systems, human environment systems, and socio-ecological systems are prevalent. So human nature systems used to be studied in separation. Remember, we talked about not so long ago, there was a big thinking or a thought line that humans are isolated or separated from natural systems. And that is in fact not true. Because then we start getting a lot of environmental issues, social issues. We are integrated into nature and hence human natural systems or human nature systems. So previously, the thought process was more aligned to human systems constrained by with input from or output to natural systems, or as natural systems subject to human disturbance. However, we know that in coupled human natural systems, we are part of the systems. Humans influence the natural systems influence human systems. We are not separated from the natural systems. So coupled human and natural systems involve the interactions and the feedbacks between the human and the environmental subsystems. So the dynamics of these coupled systems are highly complex, of course. So the study of these systems moves beyond normal nature society concepts because it considers contributions from emergence and other complexity theories. Remember, we did a number of models that talked about chaos theory, being non-linear and complex. Too often your physical scientists have isolated nature without considering the human context. The human and social scientists have also had difficulty in merging their theories into computer models and physical systems thinking. So chance usually exhibit many emergent properties with unique properties that do not belong separately to either human or natural systems, but they emerge from the interactions between them. And when we understand the interactions between human and natural systems, we now can start looking at predicting and managing disturbances, where we could potentially have a loss of life, in especially extreme weather events. Chance is very important in terms of integrated that into any planning. So when we look at the structure of chance, without a common framework to organize the findings, knowledge can remain isolated, of course, and does not accumulate. So within the last decade, there was significant progress made with respect to the interdisciplinary investigation modeling of chance. It is a complex system that is composed of your natural, economic, and social subsystems, and we're going to look at the next figure, talk about that. And then your coupled system is also characterized by a dynamic structure formed by the interaction of humans and the environment in specific areas of the on the Earth's surface. So we can conclude that the structural characteristics of the coupled human environment systems exist in a nested hierarchy, and that the human and social systems are part of the natural systems. So humans rely on and interact with the natural system through the receipt of ecosystem services and by modifying the environment. And that in turn has impact on the environment, and the environment then can also react. And now we get the environment needing to move or to react on becoming more resilient, for instance, based on what is happening from the human system. And that becomes really just the complex interactions of your human and your natural systems. So further continuing on the structure, the economic system is the main part of the social system and includes production, consumption, and circulation processes, natural support, economic metabolism, and social regulation, and complementary relationships, and the relationships among these three subsystems in time, space, quantity, and structure constitute the coupled social, economic, natural complex ecosystem. So chance is an integrated complex from different point of views that can be sparsed different content, such as divided into subsystems that include your resource systems, your resource units, your governance systems and users. And then from another perspective, it can also be decomposed into your economic, social, and natural hierarchical nesting structures. Okay, so this is just looking at your coupled human and natural systems. You have your, if we look on the right-hand side, your social system, and that's your market system, your economics, how money is moved. You have your consumer, you have a company, and remember externalities as well. When there's a specific, for instance, a mine or an industry, they have externalities. For instance, they influence an impact on groundwater that can move in terms of impacts on communities beyond their boundaries, for instance. Then you have the government as well, and you have your ecosystem services, of course. That's your natural ecosystems. And then if we look at your social, political, and economic settings specifically, that in terms of your governance systems, your actors, who's important for decision making, interactions and outcomes as well. And that is also related ecosystems as part of your social and natural systems. So when we look at the function of chance, the coupling system has its own structure and function and specifically includes three aspects. The first is the life support function of the natural system, supporting life. There are many benefits that humans gain from the natural environment and when ecosystems function properly. And these benefits, as we discussed earlier, are ecosystem services, and they are grouped into that four main categories. Remember, provisioning, that is the production of food and water, regulating the control of climate and disease, supporting nutrient cycles and crop pollination, and cultural, spiritual, recreational benefits. Then we also have the human perception, like institutions and culture as the core of society constituting the social system, and the function of a social system is to guarantee the survival and reproduction of the human population. Then human beings can organize purposeful production, circulation, and consumption activities for their own survival. So we organize our own survival basically in terms of what we produce, how it circulates, and how we consume it. And then we turn the material and the energy of nature into products to satisfy their immediate and long-term needs. The formation of a large-scale production system will need exchange and circulation processes, including your financial circulations and trade and circulation of information and population. And then your consumer systems include both material consumption and spiritual satisfaction, as well as the consumption of fixed assets. And these are all embedded in basically the social side of the coupled human and natural systems on your human side. The dynamic mechanisms of chance. Well, the dynamic mechanisms originates from both your natural and social forces, and the source of the natural forces is of course solar energy, including its converted fossil energy sources, which flows then through the system, resulting in a variety of physical, chemical, and biological processes, and of course changes in the natural environment. So there are three sources of social power: economic lever funds, social lever power, and the cultural lever spirit. And these three forces are complementary and act as the motive force of the social system. The coupling of natural and social forces leads to the corresponding dynamics of different levels of the complex coupled systems. And then for the natural system, we need to understand its constituent elements and their overall operating rules. How does the natural system function? And we need to investigate and understand the past. That's very important to develop a model to predict the future, because if you understand where you're coming from in terms of natural system, you have an idea of where they are. For instance, drainage, how did it look like? And for instance, now you have a mine there. Now we can predict if we need to rehabilitate it. These were originally historical drainage channels. These are the certain natural laws that was really applicable here, and this is what we need to implement going forward. And then for socioeconomic systems, we need to find ways to regulate human behavior and keep the coupled systems operating sustainably. So over the history of human development, markets and governments have emerged as the most important elements for the continuous improvement of economic production, social capacity, and the development of civilizations, of course. In the very early stages, when the supply of natural resources and ecosystems were not constrained, and we refer to that as the empty world. A long time ago, markets were the key tool for regulating economic systems through supply and demand to promote rapid and efficient economic output. So markets can also be seen and regarded as highly influential as an invisible hand that structurally supports human development. We usually predict and we forecast according to market trends. What would be important in the next season, for instance, especially when we look at specific commodities or certain crops for the next season that we need to focus on in terms of import and export markets and needs. So although the invisible hand supports economic development through markets, governments operate to ensure that the social system functions appropriately, especially where the market failure or economic crises occur. And they can be seen as the visible hand, assisting the development of societies and often reducing externalities through the creation of laws and policies resulting in taxes and subsidies. So the invisible hand of markets and the visible hand of governments provide constant contributions to the growth, development, and well-being of societies. And then from a holistic and hierarchical perspective, using scale matching principles, a third factor other than markets and governments can be identified as playing a vital role in this coupled world, and that is referred to as the third hand. Humans have a major influence in the human and natural system in this era, as we called it the Anthropocene. And therefore, human values, which are created by culture, could become the third hand in managing chance. And we do see a lot of focus globally, specifically on human culture, and that can play a significant role in chance. So, understanding the structure, function, and dynamic mechanism of chance is the basis for developing models and predictions of the future. So, but what are the implications for sustainable management? A central challenge that faces humanity is how to achieve sustainable outcomes that benefit both people and nature. And scientific disciplines use different concepts and languages to describe and explain complex human and natural systems. And without such a framework to organize research outcomes, knowledge does not accumulate. So, using a human nature approach towards the generation of knowledge and the formulation of sustainable governance solutions, of course, are critical because it explicitly recognizes the connections and feedbacks linking human and natural systems. So chance include human dependence on environment and the active role of humans in the environmental modification, which has changed with the development of human society. And then historical experience have indicated that the relationship between humans and the environment should be maintained harmoniously, and human beings should consciously use and reconstruct the natural environment in accordance with natural laws and manage the relationship between the two to achieve a goal of sustainable development or to move towards planetary health. So, studies of chance are typically interdisciplinary, of course, and the central goal is to coordinate the human-nature relationship, to focus on optimization of this human-nature system, and to enable the implementation of regional, local, and global sustainable development. So, in the coordination of human-nature relationships, your socioeconomic development and population growth have a direct and indirect feedback between natural resources and the environment, and they are, of course, intertwined with each other. Natural resources and the environment have a role in promoting and restraining human activities. Human beings invest capital in natural systems. They reduce the natural disasters. They improve environmental quality and exploit resources to achieve and optimize their outputs. So, any regional development, regional planning, and regional management must aim to improve the structure of regional human environment interactions and to promote harmonious human environment interactions. Then markets and governments alone are not sufficient to manage this new macroeconomic system, and we suggest an integration of markets, governments, and human values to manage the coupled systems, not forgetting the traditional knowledge as well. Narrow economic, political, and scientific solutions all do not adequately address sustainability of natural ecosystems. Okay, so let's consider a chance example. So let's say we take an example of a specific lodge or a guest lodge. First of all, if you look in the middle of that diagram, you will see that that basically focuses as a unit. So you have the infrastructure and the services associated with the game lodge. You've got ecotourism activities, and you've got local, environmental, social, and economic area of influence. So within the system, you've got a lot of interactions between human and the nature. Remember, you have to deal with your sewage. You have to deal with food waste. So whatever, let's say, impact you have on nature, there will be a reaction from nature as well. And those are all the interactions that are taking place. But then we must also remember that that lodge is not alone. So next to that lodge can be another lodge. So whatever you do on your side might impact on your neighbor. So there's constant flow of interactions between you, within your own system, influencing the adjacent system and the adjacent system influencing your system as well. So remember then also you import and you export certain aspects from the environment as well. You can import, for instance, energy from a specific system. Let's say you've got solar panels in another area, which is not specifically in your area as well. Or you can import food, let's say from the market, which you do not produce on your own premises. But you can also export waste. For instance, your sewage that you need to treat, or your paper and packaging and everything that you need to treat, that can also be an export that you have. But it can also be positive. For instance, you can also be exporting biodiversity components if you maintain your area uh, quite nicely, or you have restoration rehabilitation activities applicable on disturbed areas. You start enhancing ecosystem services, and that can also be an export to adjacent areas. So yes, there's a lot of interactions taking place the whole time basically between what we are doing, where we are, our neighbors, adjacent systems, etc. So that is quite important to take note of that. So when we look at the coupling map, or we also call it the causal loop diagram, this specific diagram is used to map and to illustrate connections between aspects in the human and natural side. So you'll see on the left-hand side, it's almost like a faint column. That is your natural interaction. So that will be your pure, let's say, ecological infrastructure, natural infrastructure. You might have rivers there, you might have soil, you might have your ecosystem processes, you might have climate there. Something, and I know this is something that you have to do for your summative assignment as well. So on your left-hand side, on your natural section, you have to identify the natural components, the important natural components of your system. Then on the far right column, you have your human or your socio-economic interactions, and that is basically your human component. That is where your infrastructure are included. Maybe hospitals, schools, you've got governance systems, your economy, you've got markets there. Everything that you can attribute purely to a human system. And then basically when those two come together, there are certain interactions. So for instance, when you have a hospital, you will generate waste, and then waste will be placed in the middle. But waste can have, if it's not managed correctly, on that specific area, it can negatively impact on your rivers, for instance, and then you'll have an arrow going that side with a minus sign. But you can also have, for instance, let's say you are a tourism establishment and you do your composting of your food waste. That is a positive aspect as well. So the idea is here, and it's a very simplified version of your causal loop diagram, is to map looking specifically at your case study, your natural components and your human components on two ends. And then where they come together, the impacts generated, you write basically in the middle. And then also even your mitigation aspects. For instance, if you put in a constructed wetland to deal with certain for sewage waste, that's a positive. And that can also positively impact on biodiversity. And those arrows would then go back to biodiversity on your far left side with a positive sign as well. So this map is just basically drawing your connections. How are everything intertwined? So complex environmental problems cannot be analyzed using isolated or separate disciplinary approaches, and the coupling map really help us to really illustrate that nicely. They must be dealt with in an integrative and interdisciplinary way that considers the interaction between your social and ecological systems. So it's proposed that the structural characteristics of the trans system have a nested hierarchy, and that the natural support, economic metabolism, and social regulation and complementary relationships among these three subsystems constitute the coupled social, economic, natural complex system, or just in short, your social natural system. So the natural ecosystem supports the social and the economic system, and the market regulates the economic system. The government regulates the social system, both directly and indirectly, through its regulation of the market system. And then under the current economic development paradigm, as anthropogenic influences in the biosphere increase, ecosystem services are increasingly diminished. So human values and cultural practices are identified as the third hand. Remember, we talked about that can work with markets and governments to manage and protect these wider natural and social values. Matching the ecological and anthropological scales, including boundary fit, structural fit, and dynamic fit, those all can increase the likelihood of sustainable governance of common resources. And it is suggested that an integrated regime of markets, governments, and human values to regulate the sustainable operation of the coupled system based on well understanding and precise prediction of the natural system. Okay, so we've had a great discussion on coupled human and natural systems. So I want you just to go to your summative assignment, go specifically and look at that section, especially your coupling map, and make sure that you understand what it is all about. And then we will be going over to the water, energy, food nexus, which will definitely be quite new to a lot of you. We have touched on this during the class, But it's important as there's also some important sections on this in your final assignment. Okay, so let's go into the final part of our discussion, and that is talking about the nexus. So when we talk about the nexus, it is basically referring to a connection of things. And a nexus is used to address externalities. It can include land, water, energy. We usually talk about the water, energy, food nexus. Important that systems are inextricably linked. They are interrelated and interdependent. So the nexus is also regarded as a material problem. That's very important. We see that a lot in terms of utilizing and looking specifically at energy and food. It can be very complex to understand. It's only really started now to start unpacking the nexus in terms of building a kind of a nexus for water, energy, food. And also the sustainability problems have been described as being wicked. That is, they are extremely difficult to model properly and to solve. So the nexus is also an analytical challenge. So the international development community is embracing the notion that the water energy nexus is useful as a major policy and management concept for sustainable development. Transparent, integrated, and multi-objective planning is vital in order to maintain public trust and ensure fair and equitable access to water by different users. So the nexus can also be regarded as a governance problem. So when we look at the nexus, it's difficult to define because it refers to three different elements determining a process of learning. First of all, in relation to action in the external world, the nexus indicates that we are not capable of handling properly the integrated management specifically of water, energy, food in the landscape. And additionally to the nexus, we can also add land and biodiversity, but we are mainly discussing water, energy, and food. In relation to science, the nexus indicates that we do not know how to represent in effective terms the interlinkages between water, energy, and food in a landscape. And then in relation to governance, the nexus indicates that the existing institutions operating in the societal system are not capable of coordinating the integrated management of water, energy, and food in the landscape. So because of these reasons, and in order to properly understand and assess the nexus, we need to take approaches from complexity science again. So the quantitative analysis of the nexus between water, energy, and food in social ecological systems is challenging because the different flows are entangled into patterns defined by different processes at different scales of analysis. For instance, the profile of nutrients found in food products versus the profile of nutrients required in a diet. Different dimensions of analysis require the use of different scales and different dimensions of analysis. There's also an impredicative relation over the characteristics of the metabolic pattern of social ecological systems in terms of the feasibility. When we talk about the feasibility of something, we look at the external constraints. But when something is viable, we investigate the viability. We talk about internal constraints, and then we have desirability, cultural constraints. They do affect each other in an unpredicative way. So social ecological systems are metabolic systems, and therefore they are open systems. In order to characterize their metabolic pattern, we must first of all define their level of openness. They are not closed systems. Okay, so the challenge regarding the water, energy, food nexus is the establishment of a sustainable development plan that addresses all needs without producing a shortage of natural resources. So at the beginning, the awareness of natural resource sustainability focuses on water, which is primarily the human consumption product. However, once the energy demand, like electricity or gasoline or paraffin, increase, the focus broadened to include the energy sector. Then there was the issue of food security, and that was the last component of the WEF nexus, and that needs to be acknowledged because the interconnections among water, energy, food are considered in the concept of integrated water resource management. So currently, integrated water resource management has been implemented in several countries in order to balance the water allocation for energy and for food. So in practice, integrated water resource management considers water as a primary component, while energy and food are the dependent components. So the concept puts each element as a separate individual sector, and hence it's difficult to accommodate the broader integration by adding other sectors or institutions or enlarging the scales. So when we talk about the nexus, we also talk about a grammar. And that is basically how we illustrate the nexus. And that's an expected set of relations over elements defined in semantic terms. So in a language, the grammar refers to the study of words. If we talk about, for instance, the English language, when we refer to grammar, check your grammar of your assignment, for instance, fix the grammar. That refers to the study of words and their functions within a language. You can learn a million Spanish words, but if you do not know the grammar or how to put these words together, you cannot speak Spanish. It's the same for accounting and sustainability. You may have a million data points on water consumption, for instance, in Mauritius, but if you cannot organize and make sense of the data in a grammar, and that's by means of connecting them based on their functions relations, then you cannot understand anything about the situations. So in terms of metabolic systems, they are composed of different elements: your fund elements, your flow elements, and your stock elements. So when we look at the type of supply, it can either be a fund flow, a flow coming from a fund, or a stock flow, a flow coming from a stock. So when we talk about a fund, they remain the same. They represent what the system is made of and can be used to define the size of the system. They need to be maintained. And an example here is of a renewable source. Flows are consumed or produced, illustrate what the system is doing, where things are going. They can appear as products or waste, or they can disappear as inputs. And then we have stocks, your non-renewable components. They are either reduced when reservoirs are empty or increased when filling sinks. And they are accumulated flows that allow to temporarily bypass the fund flow constraints. That's just for interest's sake, how they also divide your metabolic patterns in certain categories. And this is especially important if you start going into your wave nexus and you start drawing and compiling your grammars. So the wave nexus concept has emerged as an answer to focus and integrate all sectors with the same priority in a single framework. It consists of the water, energy, food, for instance in agriculture, and all elements are connected and they affect each other. A change in the supply or demand of any element of this nexus will affect the other elements, of course. So the interconnection is usually drawn as 3 circles representing the 3 elements and 6 arrows representing connections between the elements. And you can extend the scheme basically to add climate change, environment, governance, etc. So the common scheme representing the wave nexus is shown in the next figure. So here you'll see energy, water, and food. And those all functions within government systems and climate change and the broader environment. And of course, energy affects water. Water impacts on energy. Water impacts on energy and food also impacts on water and energy. It's an interrelated framework. Okay, so let's look at the interlinkages in the nexus. For instance, here you can see key interlinkages has been summarized as energy, land, water linkages, food, land, water, energy, food, biodiversity, land, water, biodiversity, food, biodiversity, energy. This just shows you how complicated the wave nexus can be. But still what you need to see here are the connections and how everything is interrelated. How that really impacts on one another in terms of energy, land, water, food, and biodiversity. So, although not shown in the framework, your fossil fuel energy and synthetic nitrogen-based fertilizers, as well as your livestock farming, are linked to the production of greenhouse gases, of course, and that leads to climate change and complex impacts on land, or it contributes also to climate change. And then also on other impacts on water, biodiversity, and agriculture. So human systems are also strongly linked to the nexus and are shown as external components. Water, land, energy, and food are required for people in urban and rural settlements and for industry and commerce. Biodiversity provides many positive opportunities for people in the form of leisure, sporting, cultural activities, your ecosystem service, and for well-being. So this is when we start looking at expanding the nexus from the water, energy, food to land and biodiversity. So when we specifically look at the component of water, water resources can be divided into conventional and non-conventional resources. The conventional resources include your surface water, rainfall, groundwater, while your non-conventional resources consist of desalinated water, wastewater, and drainage water. So the available water sources also could be categorized as green, blue, and grey water. Green water is the rainfall water contained in the soil for plants and ecosystems. Your blue water is pooled water in lakes, reservoirs, rivers, and aquifers, specifically for human use. And then your grey water is the household water, except the black water that could be treated and reclaimed. And then water grammar involves two analytical scales, namely the human side as a problem shed and the natural side as the watershed. So here you can see you have a fund and a flow. You have your indicates in terms of supply, recharge, extraction, and then you have your dimensions in terms of precipitation, external flow, surface, etc. And then this is your eco-social assets basically. So this just looks at the taxonomy of water in your water grammar of water in your water energy food nexus. This is also just another diagram looking at the biophysical exchange, your organization, your ecosystem metabolism, and your societal metabolism. And this is basically how it can also be illustrated. For instance, you have an E2, which is the water cycle. That's on a more broader level. When you go down from an E2 to an E1, that's your ecosystem level. On an E, then you go bit down deeper and not broader, and that goes into your water bodies. Then if you just look at the level S, that's your society. But when you delve deeper into your society, you have your social structures in terms of production, and also your social functions in terms of consumption. Okay, when you go broader than your society, you start looking at local scales, regional and maybe regional and also national scales, for instance. That's just how you start breaking it down so that you can see where your flows are, where your impacts are going to be, and what are your funds and your flows. Okay, this is just a real water grammar that I've done for Mauritius in 2010. And here you can see again your focal levels, an E or an S, whether it's a plus or a minus. A plus is a more broader level, and your minuses go down deeper as well. And then you can see you have a domestic society, you have your other society as well. So when we look at energy, the energy component refers to electricity and transportation of fuel. Currently, electricity is the main energy source supporting human activities. Electricity is generated in power plants, produced using methods such as hydropower, thermal or nuclear fusion. Renewable energy sources from the wind and solar systems are also alternatives since they consume less water and are eco-friendly. And that, of course, makes big impact on your water energy food nexus. Most transportation energy is still derived from crude oil obtaining from mining processes. The challenge in energy development is to improve the efficiency during production and consumption processes. High production efficiency will reduce the amount of water consumed during production, while high consumption efficiency will reduce the amount of actual energy needed to provide a service. So Bach suggested the three energy policies of long, legal, and loud. For sustainable development of energy, development should address the long term by considering future demand and supply. It must have a legal framework and allow for coherent implementation. And it must be loudly broadcasted to all sectors in order to produce renewable and efficient energy. This is just an example of accounting categories. For energy forms, you have your primary energy sources as a PES, and there's examples of that. For instance, oils, tons of coals, that's just the units that they use when you're really going to your water energy food nexus compilation. You have your energy carriers like electricity, fuel, heat, and steam, and then you have your end users. And that's functions which have to be performed by society or tasks done by useful energy. When you look at the food part of the nexus, food security is a serious global issue. The FAO defined food security as a condition in which all people can access sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. And this condition considers a sufficient production and balanced distribution of food products for all people in the area of interest. And what is important here is also your food quantity, the requirement, the intake, net food supply, gross food consumption, and gross food supply. This is when you start looking at your nexus compilation in more detail. So remember we talked about the nexus also being based on complexity science concepts. You have semiotics, and that's a study of signs and symbols and how they are used. Now, a semiotic process is a process involving the establishment of relationship between a sign and its object and the meaning. But what does this have to do with sustainability? So to study the behavior of complex social ecological systems, it's important to understand the role that decision makers, storytellers, and institutions play in interpreting the interactions to the external world through perceptions, explanations, interpretations. You can do all of this great work in terms of water, energy, food, but if you can't give or get that message across, then you will ultimately fail to actually get your message across in terms of the work that you have done. So in semantic terms, decision makers, analysts, or storytellers are the interpretant. The interactions being analyzed are the object, and the representations used by the interpretant are the sign. So dealing with the nexus requires a systematic understanding of the relations over the three elements used by the society to learn how to better produce and use scientific information. Any kind of research that you do, whether it's a product as well, you have to interpret basically what you have done. The interactions that you have analyzed are the objects, and those representations used, the data, the models, indicators are the signs, and that needs to be basically put in a language that people can understand, especially the specific audience you're communicating this to. So this is just a few examples of Nexus examples. For the assignment, it doesn't need to be this complicated. You just need to have the wave Nexus. You can discuss it as well, or you can draw it. But if you draw it, you need to put some notes to the illustration as well. And this is an example of water, energy, and food. For instance, energy, you have a hydropower generation, geothermal power, shale gas, water, spring water, to surface water, food, fish reproduction, and farm produce. So this is just what a typical nexus can look like for a specific area. So for your assignment, you have to basically develop a nexus based on your area. It needs to really make sense. And you have to include your water, energy, and food. This is just another illustration again, but you can go through all of these illustrations and see how they have actually illustrated it. This is also another much more simpler illustration as well. Here you can see another illustration as well, and this is also what you can look at the water, for instance, consumption of water from the specific stream for agriculture, for just sustainable, just for livelihood sustainability, for instance. You might not have biofuel, but that might be an option also, because a lot of emphasis is placed on alternative fuels. Remember, food, you can have agriculture in that area. For instance, you can have energy. For instance, the food production, it also uses energy as well. And you can include the links as well. So it's very important that you identify the main components in terms of water, energy, and food. And then you can elaborate on the links, between, for instance, food and water, or water and energy, or energy and food, for instance. Here's another illustration. Here's another one that you can go through on your own time. This is also just another schematic. Another one. So in conclusion, Nexus thinking is developing internationally. It's really growing exponentially as an attempt to understand and deal with the interdependencies which exist within complex natural and human systems. And this is becoming very important as we begin to push against the planetary boundaries of resource use and emerging resource constraints that become a limitation. So very important is also that your water, energy, food system can almost be used like a mass balance of an area to show this is the amount of resources that I have, this is the amount of food that I have, and this is the amount of energy that I need, or amount of energy that can be produced. And that can then also be used further for planning initiatives. So it's becoming an integrated consideration of food, water, and energy, and then additional with land and biodiversity is essential in local economic development planning and even in your reserve determination of aquatic systems. Decisions which benefit some components of the nexus can have negative impacts on other components. When these trade-offs are identified and quantified, decisions can be adapted or mitigated and measures put in place to optimize benefits. So in terms of doing a water, energy, food nexus, it's also a valuable tool where you can identify gaps, or you can see this area is really too arid to actually produce this kind of food. For instance, this area or this crop would need too much energy that we won't be able to provide. And then that is basically a gap. So future pressures such as climate change also need to be considered, but as a new concept, wave nexus still has many inadequacies to overcome. There's a knowledge gap, such as insufficient knowledge of connections, non-uniform regulations, inconsistent monitoring, lack of databases of resource demands and supply, unbalanced distribution, and the indistinct capability to face the increasing demands are the obstacles to develop and implement the WEF nexus. And then improvement in common practices through increases in productivity, reuse of waste, public stimulation using economic incentives, creation of coherence among governance institutions, policies, and increased capacities and awareness are all required to address the obstacles impeding the realization of the WEF nexus. Okay, thank you very much. That brings us now to the end of the presentation. Please go through the slides and also the prescribed reading on your Learn platform. Thank you.